Hello, dear students, level 6. This is the fourth video in our course, Western Intellectual History, and this is Dr. Maha Salam. Today, we are discussing a selection of the philosophy of David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher and a major figure of the Enlightenment in Scotland. Hume is also a leading name of modern empiricism, which is the school of philosophy most commonly contrasted to modern rationalism. You remember that modern rationalism was discussed in our video of René Descartes. Now, what does it mean to believe in empirical thought or to be considered an empiricist or a philosopher of the empirical school? Those philosophers like Hume who believe in empirical thought, they believe that the only way of gaining knowledge is by the use of our senses, our sight or hearing or smell or taste or touch, and not necessarily just the senses. Maybe the senses can be helped by the instruments, the technological methods that help the human senses. For example, if a doctor is using a stethoscope to listen to the heartbeats of a patient, or if someone is using a telescope or a microscope in order to study microorganisms, again, this is considered to be knowledge by the use of the senses. In other words, it is knowledge by observation or knowledge by the experimental method. So this is what David Hume mainly believed. That is why we call him an empiricist. And Hume, interestingly, extended the scope of this empirical method so that it is not just applied to the experimental sciences such as physics, biology, chemistry, etc., but also applied to such sciences as sociology or ethics. He believed that by following the empirical method, scientists or researchers can reach general laws about human nature, and human nature was one of the major topics of interest for David Hume. Now, let us talk a bit more about empiricism. If you are an empiricist, this means that you do not accept any ready-made knowledge, or what we called before a priori knowledge. You remember that we divided knowledge into a priori and a posteriori. A priori is the knowledge which is ready-made. We do not need to check it or to use our senses or our observation or anything to know it. We just know that this knowledge is so and so. Now, if you are an empiricist, you will say, no, I can never accept a priori knowledge. To me, the only possible form of knowledge is the a posteriori knowledge, which of course is the knowledge that we gain by the senses or by experimenting or by observation. All knowledge, according to empiricism, must undergo empirical verification. This concept of empirical verification is very important. To verify something means to check whether something is true or false, to verify. So empirical verification means verification by means of our sense organs, with or without the help of instruments, or from our experience. So Again, if you are an empiricist and you never accept a priori knowledge, you only accept a posteriori knowledge, and you say that all forms of knowledge require empirical verification either by the senses or by experience, to you, any statement can be either true or false, but not by necessity, only by contingency, only because the statement happens to be true or happens to be false. And how do we know them to be true or false? Not because this is something that was accepted a priori, but because we used our senses or our observation or our experience to check whether it is true or false. Now, let me ask you if you remember Cartesian rationalism. This question is quite appropriate at this moment because there are markedly divergent attitudes towards a priori and a posteriori knowledge or statements or judgments if you belong to the school of rationalism and if you belong to the school of empiricism. We have a very interesting table here. I hope it will be useful to explain to you the difference between a priori statement, and instead of statement we can say a priori concept, a priori judgment or argument, and you have on the other side of the table a posteriori statement or concept, judgment, argument. First of all, an a priori statement is not based on experience or the senses. The a posteriori is based on experience or the senses. An a priori statement does not require empirical verification, but the a posteriori one requires empirical verification. An a priori statement is either necessarily true or necessarily false, but an a posteriori one is either contingently true or contingently false. For example, let us see an example of an a priori statement. If we say one cannot be in two different places at the same time, if we say such a statement, this is an a priori one. It means that we accept such a statement to be true because it is necessarily true. We don't need to check it by our senses or to check it by our experience. We just know it deep inside us to be true. And such types of statements are accepted by the rationalists. Cartesian rationalists, René Descartes, they say that we accept that the knowledge in our universe is divided into two types. Some types of knowledge can be considered a priori, and other types can be considered a posteriori. We know this and we accept the two, and we can differentiate between the two. But when you come to the a posteriori statement, you have at the bottom of the table an example of an a posteriori statement. Suppose I tell you there are 70 students in this classroom. First of all, you will tell me, I need to use my senses in order to check or verify an empirical verification to check whether your statement is true or false. And then you will count the students maybe once or twice, or maybe you will have a colleague helping you to count in case you have missed something. And then after you finish the verification process, you will say, okay, this statement is true. If they are 70, if you find that they are 70, you will say it is true. Or if you find that they are more than 70 or less than 70, then the statement will be false. But you will say that this a posteriori statement, it is a posteriori because I had to use my senses to discover whether it is true or false. You will say this a posteriori statement is necessarily or contingently true or contingently false. In other words, it is not by necessity that there should be 70. It could equally have been possible to have 68 students or 42 students or 75 or 110. So you will just say it happens to be true or it happens to be false. And if you say it happens to be kada, you can say it is contingently true or contingently false. Now, the empiricists accept only the a posteriori statements. When you tell them something is a priori, they will say, no, let us check it. If we cannot check it, then we cannot know anything about it. Knowledge must be a posteriori. But irrationalists can accept the two types. They can differentiate that some forms of knowledge are a priori, we already know them when we are born deep inside us, and other forms are a posteriori. Now, can you imagine that we have finished our lesson of David Hume? It has been quite a short lesson. I am sure that you will be happy for that. And let me just tell you that we selected this part only about empiricism and empirical verification and the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge and how rationalists and empiricists react differently to the two forms of knowledge. We have just selected this part out of the philosophy of David Hume. Of course, Hume's philosophy encompasses many other topics. You will discover this for yourself when you go to your study notes, if you like. But let me tell you that for the purposes of this course, the good news is that you just need to study this video only. Video number 4 can be your only source of study of David Hume's philosophy, this selected portion of his philosophy. Next week, we will have another philosopher. So till then, good luck and goodbye.